Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another lesson on Big Picture Study, Survey of the Bible. Today we're going to continue looking at the Gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I had originally planned on finishing this series on the Gospels up this week, but just got too much information in it, so I don't want to try to rush through all of that and skip some things that are very important. So we're going to take it one more week. So this week we're going to talk about the trials of Jesus, and then next week, Lord willing, we're going to talk about the crucifixion, burial, resurrection, the ascension of Christ, and his continual work today. So we've gotten so far up to, we've talked about the miracles of Jesus as parables. We've talked about the birth of John and John the Baptist and Jesus. And today we're going to talk about Jesus' enemies first, leading up to the trials. Now, you can't be a man like Jesus and not have enemies. I do fear that a lot of times our view of Jesus turns him into someone that is very docile almost. He was peaceful, but he was not docile. He didn't just let things happen. He was at war, and he made enemies. You just can't say the things that Jesus said and do the things that Jesus did without rankling up some people. And so, in between the Testaments, you have, of course, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have about 400 years or so. And in between that time, you're going to see the rise of some religious groups. There's several of them, actually. But the ones that the New Testament deals with the most are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, they have a lot of differences among themselves when it comes to religious ideas, but they will find common ground in their hatred of Jesus. And here's some things that we learn about them. Number one thing that we learn about the majority of them, not all of them, were bad. In fact, we'll run into a couple of Pharisees that actually become disciples of Jesus. But for the most part, what we see is, number one, they were hypocrites. Now, the word hypocrite comes from an old Greek term that deals with stage actors. So it's really just meaning that you're pretending to be something that you're not. The Pharisees taught the people, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, a high standard of morality. But oftentimes they were much more forgiving towards themselves of the sins that they condemned in the people than they were of the people that they were preaching this to. We can read about that in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 3. The people revered them. They didn't have the inside look into the Pharisees that Jesus did, so they revered them, but Jesus exposes their hypocrisy, pretending to be devout on the outside, but they had lost their way, and so because of Jesus, many of them had lost their way privately anyway, and because Jesus exposes their hypocrisy, they hate him for it. They were also religious snobs, so to speak. The religious leaders in Jesus' day had a very clear idea, a very preconceived notion about what the Messiah, the Christ, was supposed to look like, the things he was supposed to say, the things he was supposed to do. And Jesus didn't even come close to their notions. They were expecting someone who is very handsome, someone who came from a very powerful family, that kind of thing. kind of like they were looking for a movie star type of deal. And instead, Jesus comes to them, raised by a poor carpenter in Nazareth, which was an insignificant city in Galilee. Even if they had accepted Jesus' claim of direct descension from David the king, they didn't find anything royal about him according to their own ideas. However, interesting enough, the prophet Isaiah, some 700 years before Jesus was even born, actually prophesied and said this was the very thing that was going to happen. In Isaiah chapter 53, verses 2 through 3, he says, "No form or majesty that we should look at him," talking about Jesus. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. So because of their spiritual blindness, they were very short-sighted when it came to Jesus' identity. They could not get past their prejudices. They could not accept Jesus as the Messiah, as the Son of God. And so they rejected him, just as Isaiah said that they would. They were hypocrites, they were snobs, and they were wrong. Jesus, imagine this for a second with me, or a couple minutes if you want to. Jesus is God in the flesh. That's what John chapter 1 and 1 says. Jesus claims that throughout. He gives he talks about it, and he shows us why it's true. There is no reason to doubt that Jesus is God in the flesh, incarnate. So you think about that for a second. Jesus knows and understands everything. He would be able to tell them the most complicated things in science that they hadn't even imagined yet. He could have discussed with them the finer points of higher math like calculus. Not that he would have done that, but he could have. He could have told them so many things. I mean, Solomon, who was the wisest man up until Jesus, did that very thing in the Old Testament scriptures. And so Jesus could have told folks about the, what we oftentimes think is the most important things in the world. And those things aren't not important, but instead of talking to them about math and science and all of these things, Jesus instead gives them news and lessons that they needed in order to get right with God. That's the most important thing. Everything else after that will take care of itself. You've got to get right with God. You've got to know how to get right with God. And Jesus tells us exactly how to do that in his teachings. Now, to them, Jesus was a nobody from Nazareth, but yet he could effortlessly quote from the scripture, and he repeatedly would show them how they were mistaken in their understandings of various subjects such as divorce and remarriage, the nature of God, the significance of the Sabbath. He was constantly showing them how they were mistaken. In Matthew 22:29, on one occasion, which was pretty late into Jesus' ministry, he told the Sadducees, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." You see, most of the time when Jesus' enemies came to him, they didn't come to him to learn. They actually were coming to him to try to trip him up, to try to make him look foolish. But what we always see, on the other hand, is Jesus always turns the tables, and instead of him looking foolish, they end up looking foolish, and because of that, they decide that they want to kill him. That's the common ground. They hate Jesus. The Sadducees hated him. The Pharisees hated him. They didn't like one another, and we'll see in the book of Acts that Paul will actually use their differences of opinions to help get him out of some tight spots. But, sorry about that. But here they find common ground in their hatred for Jesus. And so in their in their cruelty and jealousy, they develop a plan together that they may get Jesus crucified. The only thing that they needed was some help from one of Jesus' apostles, and of course that came in the person of Judas Iscariot. Jesus knew all along that Judas would betray him. You can read about that in John chapter 6, verses 70 through 71. The other apostles seemingly were unaware of this plan, and imagine that if they did know about the plan, they would have stopped Judas from doing what he did. We remember that for measly 30 pieces of silver, Judas betrays Jesus to his enemies, and tells them where and when they could find him late at night. And you can read about that in Matthew 26, 15 through 16. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he would oftentimes go to the Garden of Gethsemane so he could spend some quiet time there in prayer with God, and maybe even with the apostles. Judas tells Jesus' enemies about this, and they sent a large section, or a large number of soldiers to arrest him. Judas accompanied them. You read about that in John 18, 1 through 2. There's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I don't want to get into a lot of details here. Judas accompanies them and identifies Jesus to the enemies of the Lord by kissing him on the cheek. We see that in Mark 14, 44 through 46. Jesus is then arrested, as you know, and in response to his arrest, he is the only one that remained calm. The rest of the apostles fled in fear. The 11 that were left fled in fear. And so they arrest him and they take him to begin his trials. The first trial that he has is with a man by the name of Annas. Now, Annas was first taken, Jesus was first taken to his home. He was a Sadducee who was recognized. It gets a little bit complicated. There's a lot of politics. In fact, the first century world, similarly to ours, was rife with politics, and everything just always seemed like it was ready to boil into anarchy and violence. So there's a lot of politics going on here surrounding Jesus' trials and his crucifixion. But Jesus was taken to Annas, who was a Sadducee. And the reason I say there's a lot of other politics going on because the Jewish people recognized Annas as the high priest. Read about that in John 18:13. He is taken to Annas just after midnight, which actually makes these proceedings illegal if you go back and read about processes of how one was to be put under trial. It was never to be done under the darkness of night for obvious reasons. So after he meets with Annas, Annas sends him to Caiaphas. Now Caiaphas is also a Sadducee, and he's recognized by the Roman Empire as the high priest of the Jews. Very confusing. So there you get two high priests, one that's observed by the Jewish people, one that's observed by the Romans, the person that they put in power as a puppet. Interesting enough, he's actually Annas' son-in-law, so a lot of interesting things surrounding this. Now, it was in Caiaphas' courtyard that Peter denies Jesus those 3 times. And at the very instant that he denied him the 3rd time, Peter looked up. And I think about this. Peter looks up, and he saw Jesus being led out by the Roman soldiers. Their eyes met one last time. And at that point, Peter was overwhelmed with remorse, with shame, guilt, and he fled and wept. The very last time that he knew until Jesus would resurrect, but he didn't expect Jesus to resurrect. The very last time that his friend and his teacher would look at him and he at him, in Peter's mind for the next 3 days, would be when Jesus heard Peter say, "I don't know him." That would be a very heavy burden for anyone to have to live with. That's what Peter thought he was going to have to live with for the rest of his life. He lost hope. He lost hope in that instant. Now, of course, it was regained. We'll talk about that next week, probably a little bit. But at this point, Peter is just completely overwhelmed with shame and remorse, and he goes and separates himself, and he weeps. After Jesus is taken to Caiaphas, and Caiaphas is done with him, he sends him to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a court of 70 men. Most of them at this point are Pharisees and Sadducees. It was really a farce because Jesus, they already knew what they were going to do with him. They already knew what they were going to do with Jesus, but they had to make it look official. And so they take him to the Sanhedrin, but nothing would be official until the Sanhedrin found guilt in him. And so the first charge that he is condemned for is blasphemy because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, I'm sure you understood this, but the Sanhedrin is actually the highest court of the Jewish people. Again, consists of 70 men. This goes all the way back to the books that Moses had written in the law. Interesting enough, once again, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin here could only legally meet to try someone during daylight hours. But here they are, well after midnight at this point. Well after midnight. Jesus' trial is illegal on many grounds, but this is just a basic ground that it's illegal. As I said, they've already made up their minds, so they really just make a mockery of justice here. Luke chapter 22, verses 70 through 71, we see the way they treat Jesus. So they all said, "Are you the Son of God?" Then, so you imagine all these men shouting at Jesus. He's in the middle of them all. He's already been taken from the Garden of Gethsemane. He is God. He knows that this is going to happen, but he's still in the flesh, so we can relate to this. So imagine being surrounded by 70 men who are angry at you, wanting to kill you, and they all said, you can almost hear them shouting and mocking and spitting at him, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." They didn't just want to kill him. They could have taken him out and stoned him, like we see them doing with Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Instead, they hate Jesus so much that they want him to die in the most painful and excruciating and horrible way that has ever been invented and known to man, and that is by crucifixion. Crucifixion is the Roman Empire specialty. But the only way that they can get Jesus crucified is to take him before the Romans. See, the Romans let you do pretty much anything when they conquered you. There are a couple things that they reserved for themselves. Number one, you had to pay tribute to them, taxes. They were pretty much fine with religious freedom. They didn't like new religions popping up. Christianity under the Romans was viewed as just another sect of Judaism. That's why the Romans did not persecute Christians at first. Later on, they do begin persecuting them, but at first the Jews are the only one that persecute Christians. They don't mind the religious freedom. Of course, there's no freedom of speech. That's pretty much not going to come around for a long time. But they did take away your sovereignty, and the way that they took away a nation's sovereignty was they took away your right of capital punishment. The Romans had to be the ones to do that. So in Acts 7, when you see Stephen being killed for his faith in Christ, it's actually a murder taking place, not an execution. It's a mob hit, really. So they want this to be official. They want him to be crucified. So they take him to Pilate, who is the governor of Judea at that time. Pilate is a wicked man, but he's not unintelligent. And so he recognizes this as a local problem, and they should never have even involved him. So at first he only has Jesus whipped. Roman soldiers would flog him, scourge him with whips until his back was torn and bloodied. So not a good thing to go through. But he hoped that this would satisfy their bloodlust, and that he would release him, because he didn't see Jesus as guilty, and he says that in Luke 23:4. However, it doesn't. It doesn't satisfy them at all. So Pilate questions Jesus, discovers that he grew up in Nazareth. He thinks he's off the hook because that's not in his jurisdiction. He sends him, therefore, to Herod Antipas, who is the ruler in Galilee, who just happened to be in Jerusalem vacationing at that moment, maybe for Passover, I don't know. So this is the second Roman trial. Jesus has gone under 4 trials so far, 3 Jewish, 1 Roman. He's going to undergo 2 more, Herod Antipas, and he's going to go to Pilate again. Now, Herod Antipas was the very man who had ordered the beheading of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. Jesus did not speak a single word to Antipas, not one word, as we see in Luke 23, 7 through 12. Herod Antipas thought that Jesus was a circus performer. He heard of his miracles, and he thought maybe that he could get Jesus to perform a magic trick for the purpose of entertainment. Jesus refused to do so. So Herod became bored with Jesus, sent him back to Pilate. Pilate continued to realize Jesus was innocent. His wife even saw this in a dream, told him don't have anything to do with that just man, in Matthew 27:19. However, the religious leaders knew exactly how to manipulate Pilate. They dropped the Jewish charge of blasphemy because the Romans could care less about someone's religious squabbles. So instead, they charged him now with claiming to be the king of the Jews, which would be viewed as something like treason, because he was saying he was the king of the Jews when they were under Caesar. And in fact, they said in John 19:12, the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." And so now Pilate feels like his hands are tied. So he delivered them over to be crucified in John 19:16. One last thing before we go on. The person that put all this together, Pilate, that he was the one piece that they needed. He was overtaken by remorse. He saw that Jesus was going to be crucified. I don't know what was going on in Judas's mind. Been a lot of theories. I have no idea. But what we do know is that Judas became very sorry for what he had done. He went back to the temple, gave them back the 30 pieces of silver, and then he went out and hanged himself. He lost hope. Earlier I said Peter had lost hope, but he had a godly sorrow. Judas lost so much hope that he didn't think Jesus would ever take him back. But we know that would not be the truth. He didn't give Jesus a chance. He took his own life. Peter did something very similar to Judas, but as we will see as we continue and conclude the Gospels, Peter repents, and Jesus brings him back. And not only does he come back, Peter is the first person to ever preach the gospel after Jesus' resurrection. I'm getting ahead of myself. The terrible times that Jesus was going through, his apostles were going through, but it had to be done to fulfill all prophecy, to get things going, for God's will to be accomplished. God doesn't do things the easy way, guys. When God does something, it could be tough, and it could be hard. Because he doesn't go the easy route. He will do the right thing in the right way, and that's hard. And oftentimes we are concerned with right and wrong, and we need to be. We have to be. But sometimes we may be faced with decisions that neither one are wrong, but one may be more right. So we now must look to ourselves and be concerned with not just right and wrong, but also what's right and what's easy. Life is not easy, but we can still serve God, and He will still be with us no matter how hard it gets. Well, thank you all for listening today. We're going to conclude this series on the Gospels next week. Talk about the crucifixion, resurrection, also the burial. We'll throw that in there as well. And we'll also talk about the ascension. Hope you all have a good week. Stay safe. I know a lot of folks we're hearing that things are starting to take a turn for the worse again. Just please stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you soon. My prayers are with you. God bless, and bye-bye.